Hi there again, everyone. My name is Rin and I'm the Knitterly Witch. Today I'll be going over yarn and fiber. Now this is a very broad topic and I only have so much time and I don't want to overwhelm you. So here I have some very basic types of yarn. You'll find these at most craft stores in some variation thereof. And I'm also going to be going over the information that you'll find on the labels of the yarn. And of course the design will vary according to the brand, but you should be able to tell kind of what they're trying to get at when you're looking at a yarn label, so I definitely wanted to go over that as well. So here I have 3 different types of worsted weight yarn. This yarn is the Lily Sugar and Cream brand cotton yarn, and many people use this for dishcloths and homeware baskets. Cotton is going to be very absorbent and it actually gets softer over time. So even if it feels a little stiff at first, once you wash it and dry it, it'll soften up. The only thing about cotton that you have to keep in mind is that it's not going to have any memory. And what that means is that it doesn't have any internal elasticity. So if you make something like a sweater from it, it's going to sag. So it's most often used in things that don't really need a size, like a loose top or some kind of headband or a cloth or something like that. Another feature of cotton is that it's not a material that felts together. So wool will felt if you agitate it or heat it or both. And that's what accounts for shrunken Christmas sweaters and things like that. They turn into a very small size. Cotton does shrink, as you might know from just general clothing, but it's not, I find that with hand knitting it's not that much of a shrinkage factor. And so I like to use cotton for things that need to be easy to care for, like dish towels or summer tops where you'll sweat a lot in them and things like that. And the next one up is going to be a pure wool yarn. This is another worsted weight yarn, and I actually dyed this yarn myself with Kool-Aid, like the purple Kool-Aid. And again, the wool will felt if you wash and dry it, and it'll shrink a lot. So you always want to be hand washing wool items. Honestly, even the superwash that I mentioned before, superwash merino, that is something that I also wouldn't put in the dryer, but it can take a little bit more of a beating in the washing machine. I would say just be careful. You've invested time and care into your knitting, so you want to be hand washing these. The wool fabric is something that is really useful, and most knitters have some experience with wool. It's insulative, it's fire resistant, and it has a lot of memory, which means that it'll hold its shape really, really well. It's also very durable, as you can tell by the fact that some people still have heirloom wool items from hundreds of years ago even. And it's actually not common to have a wool allergy, i.e. an allergy to the lanolin, or the oil from the skin of the sheep. So most people just have skin that's sensitive to the scratchiness of the wool, and I'm definitely one of those people. I have sensitive skin, so I get kind of itchy when I wear wool, and I don't use it for things such as a sweater or a scarf, anything that I'm going to be wearing close to my skin. Finding yarns that have a blend of wool and another fiber will help to mitigate this scratchiness, so it's really up to you and your preferences as to which kinds of wool and wool blends work best for you. And some finer wools like merino tend to be good as well for people with sensitive skin. And so this coincidentally is actually a wool blend. This is acrylic and wool. They list the percentages just to be exact. I would definitely recommend that you feel this so that you get an idea of whether this will work for you. But acrylic as a fiber is very dense, and essentially it's a plastic fiber. So it's not biodegradable or particularly eco-friendly if you're concerned with that, and it's something that is very flammable. Unlike wool, which was typically used in the past to put out fires, acrylic is not something, it'll melt rather than burn up. and you don't want hot melted plastic on you, so just be careful with this around flame and don't use it to make like a pot holder or anything like that. I don't typically use acrylic yarn, mainly because it has kind of a squeaky feel on the needles. Even if you're not using plastic needles as well, it definitely has that sticky hand feel that all of the plastic products tend to have. However, I do find that that's mitigated when it comes in a blend, so that's why I have this yarn anyway. And now let's learn how to read a yarn label. So like I said before, these will vary according to the brand. This one happens to be the Martha Stewart Crafts Lion brand yarn. I think I got this from Michael or Joann's or some big box store. So on this section we have the content of the yarn. It's 65% acrylic and 35% wool. The content and the name of the yarn is shown in a few different languages. And rolling this over to here, let me bring it a little bit closer so that you can see what it says. It has the yarn company information and their website and address. And the important part that I want you to notice is that it has the color name. So they're going to have a specific color name. In this case, it's going to be green eucalyptus. But the most important thing here is actually that blue number 042 up there. That's what's called the dye lot. And even commercial yarn is dyed in large quantities. So what you want is to get yarn for the same project from the same dye lot. And the reason for this is because the yarn is dyed in batches called dye lots. And some of the dye lots turn out just a little different from others. And you wouldn't really be able to notice on its own. But if you were to do a whole project with 2 different dye lots, sometimes it's really apparent and you can really see where another dye lot was used. And right here we've just got the washing information. I'm honestly not as familiar with these symbols. The one that I want you to pay the most attention to is the do not iron. Like I said, the acrylic is pretty flammable and you might end up melting your yarn if you do that. The next piece of important information that we have here is going to be the yardage and the meterage. So we've got here 164 yards of yarn, and that translates to 150 meters for those on the metric system. The net weight is going to be less important, but sometimes you do need to know what the ounces and grams are per yard of the yarn. That's a little more advanced, and we're not going to really need that for any of this. It's a consideration that you might run into for a bigger project down the line. And for these big box yarns, we have a medium that is listed as the weight of the yarn. So what this means is that it's what's called a worsted weight yarn. Worsted weight is a very commonly used thickness of yarn, so just think of yarn weight as yarn thickness. Now I would definitely be careful of using this kind of number system because it's not that accurate from these big box stores. What I would do is I would go on Ravelry.com and look up the yarn on Ravelry to see what the thickness is that they've rated and what word they're using for the thickness of the yarn, because that's going to be more accurate to any pattern than what the number is listed as here. And over here we have gauge. So the listed gauge just means what the measurement of a square would be if you were to use the listed size needles and do cast on 18 stitches and knit for 25 rows. And you have here for knitting and for crochet, it lists for single crochet, I believe. And honestly, this is a controversial opinion, but I do not pay that much attention to gauge. So it's definitely an accuracy thing. I have not found that even when I'm teaching other knitters that the tension that they have when they're knitting makes that big of a difference to the size of the finished product. And usually you want to be paying attention to the size of what you're knitting while you're knitting it anyway. And so I wouldn't worry too much about making what they call a gauge swatch. And like I said, gauge is really just the measure of how many inches you'll get out of how many stitches and rows using a certain size of needle. So they just use this to kind of give you an idea of what the resulting fabric would be if you used this size needle and this many stitches, etc. You can kind of think of gauge as, or just knitting in general, like pixels, since it's essentially a gridded activity. What you get when you size up the pixels, i.e. when you go up on the thickness of yarn, but you keep the same size of pixels, you get a bigger image. And if you size down on the size of the pixels or the size of the yarn, you're going to get a smaller product. You're also going to get more space in between the stitches if you use a bigger needle. So that's really all you need to understand about that. So there's a lot of really useful information on the yarn label, and it's not always laid out like this. I'm going to show you a different brand of yarn and how they give their information. So it's from Plymouth Yarn Company. Again, they list their company information and their washing instructions here with all the symbols. On the front here we've got the name of the yarn, Baby Alpaca Lace, and its lace weight. It's right in the title. And let me unfurl this here. We've got dye lot 151266, and it's a 100% baby alpaca, so that's the fiber content. It's a lace weight yarn, and it's 537 yards. So here they're relying on you to be able to type that into Google and convert that to meters if you use the metric system instead. But this is what other yarn, some of the label designs will be different, and they'll vary according to the brand. So that's just something to watch out for. Now, as I've mentioned, for our class we're going to be using worsted weight yarn, but I did want to show you what some other types of yarn looked like and what the thicknesses look like. So this is going to be a lace weight yarn, like I mentioned before, and that's going to be knitted usually actually with a bigger needle so that you get a lot of space between the holes in the stitches, and that contributes to that airy lace effect. This is going to be, I think, a bulky weight yarn, and so you can see that it has a core in the middle and it's really fluffy around the strand. And this is a type of bulky wool yarn, and this is called roving. So when I stretch it, it kind of, you can see that there's a lot of air in the strand, and it's thicker and thinner all along the strand of yarn. This is a wool that is not going to have different plies. So basically one ply is one of these strands, and then they're twisted around each other for other plies of yarn. So that's what the other two yarns were, is they were several ply yarns. This is another single strand yarn, but since it's that fluffy type, it doesn't have as much air in it, and it doesn't have the same properties as the roving would. So on the left we have the acrylic and wool blend ply, we have a totally acrylic novelty yarn in the center, and then on the right we have the single ply roving wool yarn. And the two on the right are going to be a bulky weight, I believe, and of course the one on the left is our worsted weight that we'll be working with. But I wanted to show you more examples of the bulky yarn just because that's a really common type of yarn that you'll find at the craft store. They don't work with as much lace since it's kind of a more advanced pattern that'll use lace yarn. And this fluffy acrylic yarn has almost no stitch definition. So what that means is that you really have to stretch it out to try to see the stitches, and even then you really can't distinguish one stitch from another. And so this kind of fluffy novelty yarn is best used for like a stuffed animal or just something that you wanted to look really fluffy like that. And I wanted to show you an example of what the thick and thin yarn looked like knitted up. And this isn't actually a totally different yarn than this wool roving. The one on the left is like a cashmere yarn, but the single strand or the single ply yarn, I was saying before, this is what it looks like twisted up. So you can see that it's a lot more even when you twist it. You can still see a little variation, but it's not as airy and it doesn't stretch or squish down like it did before. So the properties of a single ply yarn are that it's a little bit different than a regular yarn. And you can see that since it doesn't have as much twist and structure, it gets really fluffy and pilly. So you'll notice a lot of pilling on fabric that's knitted up with a single ply or roving yarn such as that. And for contrast, I'm going to bring back our friend, the acrylic wool blend. So with this worsted weight yarn, since it's plied so evenly and it's such an even thickness of yarn, all of these are kind of like that. They'll have a lot of stitch definition, so you'll clearly be able to see the stitches when you knit with this yarn. So I hope that you feel a little bit more comfortable picking out a yarn that appeals to you when you go to the craft store or when you're shopping online for your yarn. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me through this second video in the Learning to Knit with a Witch series. Again, don't forget the hashtag, the Facebook event group, and the Discord channel that I've made for this class, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!